Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review, and today I'll look at the OneOdio Monitor 60 and Monitor 80 headphones. If you've watched the channel for a while, you'll know that I move between doing budget audio, like what we have here, and also high-end audio as well. Really anything at all that produces music in the form of headphones, DACs, amps, etc. I'm interested in it if it can sound good. When I reviewed the OneOdio Pro 50 some time ago, I was fairly impressed with them for their price. And so when OneOdio reached out to me and offered the Monitor 60 and 80, I was interested to hear what they sounded like. For me, it's not so much about how expensive a product is, so much as how good it can sound. And there's great sounding products at every price point in this hobby. I was keen to see if the Monitor 60 and 80 fit that bill. By way of a little introduction, the Monitor 60, which is this one here, is a $60 open back, or at least semi-open back headphone, and it's a 38 ohm 110 decibel sensitivity, making it a very easy unit to drive from a smartphone, a dongle device, pretty much anything you like. The Monitor 80 on the other hand is a 250 ohm headphone with 100 decibel sensitivity, making it somewhat more difficult to drive, but not crazy. If you've got an amp that can drive say an HD6XX or a 58X for instance, then it could also drive the Monitor 80s here. I was particularly interested in the Monitor 80s as a high impedance option because that brings extra versatility with all the different sources you can use, including some of the budget OTL amps like the recently reviewed X-Duo TA26. But honestly, both were still interesting, and so I gave them both a go. Now, two other things I should mention before we dive deep into this review is that I've got an extra microphone here. If you watched my recent review of the K9 Pro from Fio, you will have seen a similar looking microphone also in this spot. I'm currently testing the M70 and M90 headphones from Beyerdynamic. That's their new creator range. And so watch out for that review coming soon, and make sure you subscribe and ring the notification bell if you want to catch that one. The other thing I want to mention quickly is that Benks have sent me their headphone stand that you see me using here for me to try out and see if I like it. I'm not going to do a full review on this, there's not enough to talk about for a headphone stand, but it's a pretty slick looking device. It's got a heavy metal base, it's got this nice kind of dark chrome sort of stand here with the curved rest for the band there, it's got a little bit of sort of silicone or rubber padding. It's a really nice stand in many ways. The reason I was particularly interested in it though is that it's also got wireless charging built into the base, so if you've got a smartphone that handles wireless charging, you can pop your smartphone there and let it charge all day on your desk without having to plug it in, of course. Even though this isn't a full review of the headphone stand, the one thing I do want to mention in case you like the sound of the functionality and the look of it is that the curved style of the headband rest does mean that some headphones work better than others. If you've got a headband like an HD6XX or indeed the OneOdios here, they'll sit really nicely inside the curve. But if you've got something with a broader headband like a ZMF or a pair of Meza, anything with that suspension band style approach, it's not going to sit so well, so do keep that in mind if you're looking at the Benks. Beyond that, it's a serviceable stand, I really like it, and I wanted to mention it here. And so with that said, let's talk about the Monitor 60 and the Monitor 80. And I'm going to begin with the cheaper Monitor 60. These come in at just $80, making them a very affordable headphone. I've already mentioned that they're 38 ohms and 110 decibel sensitivity, making them very easy to drive from anything at all. In addition to the headphones themselves, what you get in the box with the Monitor 60s is you get a carry pouch. It's sort of a fake leathery type carry pouch. And you also get 3 cables. You get a straight cable with a microphone, a straight cable with no microphone, and then a cable with a coiled springy section as well. Something that's really unique to OneOdio, and it's in these headphones, both the Monitor 60 and the Monitor 80, it was also in the Pro 50s that I reviewed before, is that on the headphones themselves, they've got 2 cable entries, but they're not for using balanced. The way these work is that you've got a 3.5mm on one side and a 6.3mm on the other. That means that when you get the cables in the box, at least one of them is going to have a 6.3mm at one end and a 3.5 at the other. The idea of that is you can easily change between a 3.5mm output device and a 6.3mm output device with no adapters. So let's say you've got a portable device with 3.5mm output. You plug the big end, the 6.3mm in here, and you plug the 3.5 into the device. Then you want to go to your desktop setup, which has got a 6.3mm output. You just turn the cable around. So the 6.3mm now goes into the headphone amp and the 3.5mm into the headphones. It's a really clever design and it prevents the need for extra adapters and bits and pieces you can lose. Of course, it means you can't run these balanced, but they're really not intended for that level of headphone. These are an entry-level, budget-conscious headphone that isn't meant to be paired up with top-end balanced amplifiers. It's the sort of thing you'd put with a recently reviewed SMSL SH6 and SU6 stack, or a topping L30 and E30, or maybe just a simple dongle, and get great listening pleasure out of them, assuming they sound good, and we'll get to that in a moment. Before we get there, I just want to talk briefly about the design of these, and that is to say that they do feel pretty cheap because they are pretty cheap. The headband's got decent padding on it, but it is fairly soft. The cups themselves, you probably can already see this in me handling them. They're pretty lightweight the way they move. There's not a lot of resistance and it does make it feel a bit cheap. They're also all plastic and it feels like a lower quality plastic, again, as you'd expect for the price. They've got these fairly plush and deep pads for the ears and a decent amount of space, both in terms of the opening is not too small, it's not huge, but it's not tiny. And then also the depth of the ear pads is quite good as well. The same very soft foam is used on the inside of the pads, I think, compared to what's on the headband. And that means that they are very comfortable on the head. I don't know that they're perfect on the head for long listening sessions, but again at the price, they're as good as I'd expect. The final thing I want to point out is that they are quite a bulky headphone. So if you're conscious about the size of the headphones, maybe you're wearing them on video calls and stuff like that, these are a fairly hefty looking headphone. So keep that in mind if that's important. Before we talk sound and while we're talking about design and things like that, I just want to jump over to the Monitor 80s and cover off all the same stuff in terms of accessories and the design of them with the finish, the fit, the build quality, etc. The Monitor 80s here come in at $100 US, so they're $20 more than the Monitor 60s. As I've already said, they're also harder to drive, being a 250 ohm and 100 decibel sensitivity driver. They're still easy enough to drive though, and I don't see anyone having a problem running them out of a dongle or a simple device like that. Where the Monitor 60 came with 3 cables, the Monitor 80 only comes with 2. There's no microphone cable with the Monitor 80. There's sort of a different style of headphone, I think. It's not clearly listed anywhere on OneAudio's marketing, but I get the sense that these are designed, that being the Monitor 60s, more as kind of a DJ, portable, out and about sort of headphone that's a bit more consumer focused. Whereas I feel like with the Monitor 80, they have actually thought a bit more about maybe catering to beginning music producers, people that are starting to tinker with audio and want something that's fairly neutral, as we'll talk about when we get to the tuning, but also therefore accessorized for that kind of use. So gone is the microphone cable, and instead we've got a straight and a coiled cable only. Talking about the design and the build, these are a more compact headphone than the Monitor 60s, and part of that comes down to the fact that they're using a flatter velour style pad, but it's still a very comfortable pad because it is velour and it's still nice and soft. I don't know if you can hear the creaking as I'm holding them, but just like the Monitor 60, they are still very plastic, very light, and they don't feel particularly well made. I don't think they're going to break easily, I'm not suggesting that, but they definitely feel like the price you're paying. That is $80 to $100 US. Finally, just like the Monitor 60s, we've got the 2 cable entries again. This time they're forward facing. We've got 6.3mm on one side and 3.5 on the other. So very, very similar in that regard. In all other ways, the headband structure and everything is identical to the Monitor 60s. So let's talk sound, starting with the cheaper Monitor 60, and I have to say, I was not particularly impressed with what I heard. They're not bad, they're not completely unenjoyable, but they're not a headphone I'm going to recommend. The sound from the Monitor 60s is quite boxy. As you'll see from the graph on screen, they've got a slightly uneven response. They've got a bit too much emphasis in that mid-bass area, and it just throws off the tonality of these a bit too much for me. Like I said, they're not unenjoyable. It's a sound that you do adjust to if you spend a bit of time with them, but they definitely have a slightly boxy tonality. They also have a slightly metallic or harsh, maybe even grainy treble, you could say. Generally speaking, I'd say the Monitor 60 comes across sounding like a cheap headphone. A headphone where maybe they've taken a driver off the shelf, they've taken a cup design off the shelf, they've put the two together, and they haven't taken the time and the research and development to really carefully damp and tune the headphone properly. Again, it's not a dreadful sounding headphone. If someone said, here, this is all you can listen to for a week, I'd still be listening to music, but I also know that I wouldn't be enjoying the music as much as I might on a different headphone. Even another cheaper headphone, like say OneAudio's own Pro 50. I definitely found that more enjoyable than the Monitor 60. I don't have the two of them here to compare, but I remember liking the Pro 50 more than I do the Monitor 60. And so I'm not going to go on about the Monitor 60 any further. Suffice to say, it's not dreadful. If you end up with a pair, it's not a bad thing. But if you do have the choice, I think there's better headphones out there. And with that in mind, let's talk about the Monitor 80. Unlike the Monitor 60, I think the Monitor 80 is an excellent headphone for its price. I'm not suggesting for a second that it's the best headphone I've heard. I'm not saying it's worth way more money than what they're charging, but for the price tag, I think it hits the mark and maybe goes beyond the mark just a little bit. Across all frequencies, the tonality is generally pretty balanced. I do think there's something just ever so slightly off in the tuning in the upper mid-range area, but it's very minor and it's certainly not a big deal. It's not specific enough that I can call it out. I just know that as I listened to it, I was aware that something was just not 100% natural. But that can be said for lots of headphones, so it's not really a knock on the Monitor 80, so much as to say that at $100 you expect a few compromises. The Monitor 80 produces a fairly modest sized soundstage, but within that soundstage it produces a nice sense of image focus and a decent amount of separation too. The staging is generally all inside the head. The occasional note might creep just beyond the ears, but generally speaking it's all inside the head and just slightly forward, sort of up into the forehead area. That means that layering and depth in the soundstage are pretty limited, but again, at $100, I don't really expect a lot of layering. That's something you generally only get as you go up to multiple hundreds of dollars. Coming back around to tonality before we get into some comparisons, the Monitor 80 I found had just a little bit of extra energy in the treble that occasionally makes it come across just a tiny bit aggressive, but it's very, very minor. It's not enough that it ever made me uncomfortable and made me want to stop listening to them. But I was also aware that they're not a completely natural experience and they're also not completely smooth through that upper mid-range and treble. There's just a bit of extra energy that's a tiny bit too much sometimes. At the other end of the scale, and probably part of why the treble comes across too aggressive, the bass does roll off a little bit early and is probably just a little bit shy of neutral. So they're a slightly leaner sounding headphone overall. They are going to be better suited to monitoring situations or for those that like a lean or let's say neutral / lean sound, but they're also not going too far into that space and therefore maintaining a level of enjoyment and musicality for those that just want to listen to music. Now, while we're talking tonality, I should mention that being a 250 ohm headphone, they do suit use with things like OTL amplifiers and other high output impedance devices. And so I tried them out to see what that did to the treble and the overall tonality, and the shift was pretty minor. So these aren't going to transform completely with say an OTL amp, but do keep in mind that often the OTL amps have a slightly smoother sound, or at least you can choose a tube that makes it a smoother sound, and therefore they might be a good fit for some of those OTL amps out there where maybe you've got a smoother sound to start with, like a Dark Voice 336. Or maybe you've got some tubes that you can use, and therefore you can sort of match the tonality of the amp with the headphone and not have any trade-offs because 250 ohms works great with high output impedance amps. So they are versatile in that regard, and they are definitely worth considering for those of you that are into OTL and other tube-based amps. And so with all that said, let me give you a couple of selected comparisons to put the Monitor 80s into context. I haven't done any comparisons with the Monitor 60s, I just don't really see the point when you could go straight to the Monitor 80s or elsewhere in the range of OneOdio like the Pro 50. And so we're going to start with the Monitor 80 up against the Sennheiser HD560S. The HD560S is a more expensive headphone. It's a headphone that I like and I respect, but I don't love because it's got a few comfort issues. And in that regard, I do actually find the Monitor 80 a more comfortable wear. I just find the earpads on the HD560S never feel like they're fitting me properly. The HD560S is clearly a better built headphone. It feels more quality than the Monitor 80, but the Monitor 80 is more comfortable once it's on the head for me. Putting that aside though, and just talking about the sound, I was listening to Samson by Regina Spektor as I did this comparison, and what I found was the Monitor 80s on this track were generally very enjoyable. As I've already mentioned, there was just a little bit more treble energy than I would have liked, and it did make things just a little bit hot up top, but it never quite got into sibilance or harshness, and so it didn't really affect my enjoyment of the track. from the Monitor 80s, the vocals from Regina Spektor are very close and very intimate. And I don't mean that in a bad way necessarily, it's just a different presentation and it kind of allows you to hone in on what's going on with the vocal itself should you want to. The Monitor 80 positions the piano just ever so slightly off to the left-hand side of center, and the strings when they come in are also quite close in and actually probably too close in to feel natural. It feels like the piano, the strings, and the vocalist are all pretty compressed into the same space, and that makes it an unnatural presentation because you know it's physically not possible. It's not a big deal at all, and tonally everything was completely fine with some of those comments I made earlier about it being ever so slightly off, but not enough to ever be distracting or unnatural sounding. When I switched over to the HD560S though, I definitely heard the difference. I heard why you might pay more for the HD560S. Regina Spektor's vocals were immediately more natural and transparent, and it allowed me to really picture her kind of singing right into the mic and picking up on all of the nuance and detail of the performance. From the Monitor 80, it sounded like a really nice rendition of a recording, whereas the HD560S was able to bring it to life just a bit more. Now, both of these are still relatively affordable headphones, so neither of them is playing at the level of super duper flagship headphones, but there was a clear difference stepping up from the Monitor 80 to the HD560 in terms of price and therefore performance. That said, the HD560S still isn't perfect. It also has a bit too much energy coming through in the treble and does make this track, like the Monitor 80, just a little bit too hot without going quite too far. Another area that the HD560S improves though is it does produce a bit more space in the soundstage, and that allows things like what I said before, the spacing of the orchestra, the separation of the instruments to all sound a bit more natural. There's just a bit more space between the piano and the vocalist, and a bit more space again out to the orchestra. It's not huge, it's not expansive, but it's better than the Monitor 80. And so for me, where I was left after this comparison was that I think both are very good headphones. They've got quite a lot in common, but I think the HD560S is doing it all just a little bit better and shows why you'd spend the extra. In contrast, it also shows that for what you're paying for the Monitor 80s, they're doing a very good job to stack up somewhat with the HD560S. And so if you're looking for something like the HD560S, but you're working with a tighter budget, the Monitor 80 could be a fantastic choice. And so speaking of working on a budget, the other headphone that then jumped to mind was the recently reduced HiFiMan HE400 SE. This came all the way down to I think it was $109 recently, and so it puts it almost level pegging with the Monitor 80. That immediately sounded to me like tough competition, so I thought I'd check it out. One of the tracks I tried for this test was The One I Love by REM, and that's quite a dry, fairly neutral sounding recording at the best of times. Putting that through both headphones, from the Monitor 80 it came across clean and neutral, but just a little bit harsh in the treble again. Interestingly, the HE400 SE comes across even leaner, it's got less bass, it's got more treble, but the treble is more smoothly delivered. I spoke about that in the review of the HE400 SE. I'm putting that down to the stealth magnet technology, allowing the waveform to be less distorted, less broken up as it arrives at your ears. And so for me, the treble from the HE400 SE is actually more enjoyable, even though it's over-enhanced compared to the Monitor 80, and indeed, both of them are slightly over-enhanced compared to neutral. Having said that, that tonality shift where the HE400 SE is more treble focused takes some of the weight out of the vocals. Michael Stipe from REM has a fairly upper register voice anyway, and so when you put that through the HE400 SE, it started to lack a bit of body and a bit of weight, whereas I felt like the mid-range from the Monitor 80 was actually better balanced overall. It gave me a better sense of the correct tonality of the overall recording. That also carries through to things like the drums, the guitars, and the bass, where the Monitor 80 gives all of them a bit more body and a bit more weight and presence, making it overall a more natural rendition. And so I was actually a bit surprised at the end of this comparison to find that if I had to choose between the HE400 SE and the Monitor 80, I'd probably actually lean towards the Monitor 80. And I'm a big HiFiMan fan. I love most of their headphones. I've thought for a long time the HE400 SE was a great choice. And indeed, I'd probably still recommend the HE400 SE to most people because I think the build quality is a bit better. Yes, I know it's HiFiMan, and yet still, I think the build quality at least feels a bit better than the Monitor 80. But having said that, if you said to me which one do I want to listen to, I think I'd probably go for the Monitor 80. I just prefer that little bit of extra body and warmth in its sound. It's not a warm sounding headphone by any stretch. It's slightly leaner than neutral, but it's not as treble tilted as the HE400 SE. And despite having that slightly harsh quality, that slightly grainy quality to the treble, I do think it's the headphone that's better tonally balanced overall for my music tastes. On top of that, the fact that at 250 ohms, I can pair it with any device I like, and therefore I can kind of tweak what I'm hearing using, say, an OTL amp like the X2O TA26, or maybe something like a KN RU6 dongle DAC. There's lots of ways to smooth off that treble and then enjoy the overall tonality. Of course, you could say the same with the HE400 SE, that you can just use EQ to lift the bass, and that's completely true and valid. So ultimately, what I'm saying here is that both of those headphones at that $100 to $110 price point are really great choices. And it's going to come down to which initial starting tuning you prefer, whether you're valuing the smoothness in treble over the slightly more natural tonality that the Monitor 80 comes with. Either way, it's hard to go too far wrong with either, and I think the Monitor 80, for me at least, has set itself as a viable contender in that budget open back headphone market. I really appreciate OneOdio sending these samples out to me. I'm sorry I can't say better things about the Monitor 60. It's not bad, but I'm not going to recommend it. But definitely the Monitor 80 has won a place in my heart and my recommendation list. And so if you found this review helpful, maybe it's helped steer you away from the 60 towards the 80, maybe it's just helped clarify your options in this budget headphone market. If it's been helpful to you, I'd love it if you'd hit subscribe, ring the notification bell, and hit the like button to tell YouTube and me that you want to see more videos like this one. I've got some great content coming down the pipeline, so do make sure you stay tuned. I look forward to seeing you next time, but for now, let me leave it to the music, so happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.